20 consultants signed the same conclusion. Vivian Blackwood had to walk away from the deal before it dragged her company under. Red charts filled the screen, and the board sat in silence waiting for her to surrender. But just as her pen touched the withdrawal papers, Nolan Reed, a single father who worked contract reconciliation on the factory floor, stood up and said that every person in that room had read the numbers wrong. The room laughed. Nolan did not. He simply opened a page no one else wanted to look at again, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything the 20 experts had said all morning. If you love watching quiet intelligence outsmart arrogance and power, stay with this story until the very end. The emergency meeting took place on the top floor of the Blackwood Industrial Group Tower, where the glass walls made the whole city look small and manageable, which was exactly the illusion Vivian needed that morning. She was considering the acquisition of Astron Components, a deal worth several $100 million that would give Blackwood the heat-resistant component technology it needed to win a long-term manufacturing contract. For 6 weeks, 20 consultants had investigated every corner of Astron's operations, and they had arrived, without exception, at the same grim verdict. Revenue was collapsing. 4 major customers had walked away. There was a hidden warranty obligation that could bankrupt the acquisition before it even closed. The primary factory was outdated, and the land itself carried the risk of an environmental liability large enough to swallow whatever profit remained. Bryce Halstead, the lead partner from Halstead, Bourne and Keller, stood at the head of the table and called Astron not an acquisition, but a sinking ship, and nobody in the room seemed inclined to disagree with him. Damian Lockridge, Blackwood's chief financial officer, pressed Vivian to sign the withdrawal that same night, insisting that every additional hour of delay would cost the company a commitment fee they could not justify. The air conditioning hummed too loudly for a room that expensive, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from a cart nobody had touched since dawn. Small details that seemed to matter more to Nolan than the murmuring numbers on the projector, because he had spent his whole working life noticing the things everyone else stopped seeing. Nolan had only been asked to carry a box of original factory records up to the meeting room, a courier's task assigned to him because he happened to be the person who understood the archive best. He was not supposed to speak. He was supposed to set the box down, nod, and disappear back into the elevator the way he always did. He had driven 2 hours that morning after dropping Mara at school, rehearsing nothing more ambitious than the short apology he planned to give if traffic made him late, and he had certainly never imagined standing in a boardroom full of people who earned more in a week than he made in half a year. His jacket still smelled faintly of the factory floor, machine oil, and cold metal, a scent that clung to him the way expensive cologne clung to the men seated at the long table. He felt the old, familiar instinct to stay small, to let the box speak for him and nothing more, the same instinct that had kept him quiet through years of meetings where his name was never on the agenda. But when the warranty chart flashed onto the screen, Nolan noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The same figure had been counted twice, once under an old account code and once under a new one. He tried to mention it quietly to an assistant near the door, but he was told to stand still and wait to be handed his empty box. Vivian lifted her pen toward the withdrawal document, and Nolan understood, in that single suspended second, that if he stayed silent, thousands of workers in a town not so different from his own would lose their jobs over an error nobody had bothered to check. So he spoke, and his voice was steadier than he expected it to be. "The number on that warranty chart does not exist," he said, "not the way you are presenting it." And every head in the room turned toward the man in the plain work jacket standing near the door with an empty cardboard box still in his hands. Bryce asked, in a tone dipped in condescension, what credentials qualified him to overturn 6 weeks of expert analysis. And for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath. waiting to see whether the stranger would shrink or stay. Nolan did not shrink. He introduced himself plainly as the man who reconciled contract data at Asteron, and Bryce immediately tried to reduce him further, calling him a data entry clerk in front of the entire board, as if the title alone could erase what he had just said. A few of the consultants laughed under their breath, amused that someone without a management title had wandered into their meeting carrying paper instead of a laptop. Nolan let the laughter pass over him without flinching, because he had learned long ago that reacting to mockery only slowed him down. Instead of arguing about his job title, he asked them to open a specific page in the appendix, a page most of them had barely glanced at during their 6 weeks of work. He explained that Asteron had switched accounting systems the previous year, and during that transition the warranty reserve had been recorded twice, once to close out the old ledger and once to preserve continuity in the new one. It was never two separate debts. It was one number wearing two different masks, and the consulting team had added both masks together, as if they were strangers. Bryce insisted his audit team had already reconciled the balance sheets, but Nolan asked a simple, precise question: had anyone actually cross-checked the reversal entries recorded after the transition? Nobody answered right away, and that silence told Vivienne more than any chart on the screen. Nolan was not speaking in vague generalities the way nervous employees sometimes did when trying to seem important. He was citing document names, filing dates, and record codes with the calm certainty of a man who had lived inside those files for years. Damien interrupted, arguing that a single clerical mistake could not possibly overturn an entire strategic conclusion, and for a moment it looked as though the room might simply move past what Nolan had said. Nolan agreed, quietly, that one error alone would not be enough to reverse the recommendation. Then he added the sentence that changed the temperature of the room completely, saying that this was not the only mistake buried in the report, and that he could show them exactly where the others were hiding if they gave him the chance. He pointed to 4 contracts the consultants had marked as canceled. Contracts that had actually been folded into a new framework agreement under the parent company of each client. The consulting team had searched only for the original subsidiary names and had never checked whether those subsidiaries had been absorbed into a larger corporate entity. Bryce's composure finally cracked, and he ordered security to escort Nolan out of the building before he could waste any more of the board's time. But Vivienne raised her hand and stopped the guards before they reached him. She studied Nolan for a long moment, the way a person studies something they cannot quite categorize yet, and then she gave him exactly 30 minutes to prove that even one of those 4 clients was still active. Nolan called the production scheduling department without hesitation and asked them to display next week's delivery calendar on the main screen. Rows of shipment orders appeared, addressed to the very companies the consultants had declared gone, and the room went quiet in a completely different way than before, the kind of quiet that comes when certainty starts to crack. Vivienne did not tear up the withdrawal papers that night, but she did not sign them either. Instead, she gave Nolan 12 hours to test every claim he had made, insisting that he work directly with her, with the legal department, and with an independent internal auditor who had no stake in either outcome. Bryce objected loudly, arguing that Nolan worked for the seller and could not be trusted to investigate his own employer's finances without bias, but Nolan answered honestly that he wanted the factory to survive, though not badly enough to let Blackwood buy it on numbers that were not true. That answer seemed to settle something in Vivienne's mind, and within the hour she and Nolan were driving out to the Asteron plant together in the dark, the headlights carving narrow tunnels through the industrial outskirts of the city. She had never ridden in a car that smelled like a travel mug of drugstore coffee and a child's forgotten homework folder, and something about the ordinariness of it made her strangely comfortable, as though she had stumbled into a version of her own life that had taken a different, quieter road. Inside the factory, she watched the way machinists and shift supervisors greeted Nolan by name, the way a young technician jogged over just to ask his opinion on a stubborn calibration issue. The building itself breathed in ways her glass tower never did. Steam hissing from a pressing line somewhere overhead, the low grind of conveyor belts rolling steel toward machines that stamped and folded it into shapes she could not name. Nolan moved through it with the ease of a man walking through his own home late at night, flipping on lights he knew by memory, nodding at a night shift welder without needing to break stride. He held no formal leadership title, yet he was clearly the person people called when the numbers on a screen refused to match the reality on the floor. He led her into the records room where the software transition documents were stored, boxes stacked with a particular dust of paperwork nobody expected to need again. Together they found the reversal entries proving that most of the warranty reserve had already been returned to the books, leaving the true obligation at a fraction of what the consultants had reported. Then they turned to the 4 contracts, confirming that 3 were still fully active under their new framework agreements, while the 4th had not been canceled at all, but simply paused while the client revised a design specification. The real backlog of orders, once properly reconstructed, was worth far more than the consulting report had claimed, a gap large enough to change the entire logic of the acquisition. Vivian asked, almost to herself, why nobody at Astron had explained any of this before the consultants ever arrived. Nolan answered that Elias Whitmore, the aging owner, had grown too dependent on an old finance team that rarely left its offices, while the people who actually understood the operational systems were never invited into the rooms where decisions were made. A brief phone call interrupted them, his daughter Mara reminding him softly that he had promised to be home for breakfast, and Nolan apologized to her before explaining that he was working on something that could protect a great many families, including their own. It was a small, unguarded moment, one of the only times the story allowed the audience to see the man beneath the reconciliation reports, a father trying to hold 2 responsibilities steady at once. Vivian, watching him from across the room, understood for the first time that Nolan was not chasing recognition or a promotion. He was simply protecting the truth because it was the only thing he had ever known how to protect properly. When they finally checked the digital access logs late that night, the internal auditor discovered something that made the room go cold again. The reversal files that would have corrected the warranty error had been deliberately excluded from the folder given to the consulting team weeks earlier. The digital signature approving that exclusion did not belong to anyone at Astron. It came from inside Damien Lockridge's own office at Blackwood, a detail that turned a story about careless mistakes into something considerably darker. Vivian asked for the access permissions to be checked more carefully before confronting Damien directly, unwilling to accuse her own chief financial officer without solid proof in hand. Nolan suggested they stop searching only for who had deleted the files and start asking why someone would want Blackwood to walk away from this particular deal in the first place. Together they turned to what he believed was Astron's most valuable and most misunderstood asset, the production line responsible for manufacturing a new generation of heat-shielding components. The consulting report had valued that line at almost nothing, dismissing it as obsolete machinery more than a decade old and unworthy of serious consideration. Nolan explained that the true value never lived in the machines themselves, but in the specialized tooling, the certified processes built up over years, and the material testing records that would take a competitor an enormous amount of time to replicate from scratch. Those certifications, he added, only transferred cleanly if Astron was purchased whole, rather than broken apart and sold piece by piece, which meant the entire advantage of the deal depended on keeping the company intact. If Asteron were dismantled and sold in fragments, any new buyer would be forced to repeat years of material testing before they could manufacture anything to the same standard. Blackwood was not simply purchasing machinery, it was purchasing years of accumulated time, a head start that no amount of money could otherwise buy on the open market. Vivian began to realize that this hidden advantage alone might be worth more than the entire discounted price the consultants had recommended walking away from. Nolan walked her down to the night shift floor, where a production line reported at barely 40% capacity sat mostly quiet under the fluorescent lights. The consulting team had read that idle capacity as proof the factory was struggling, a symptom of decline rather than a deliberate choice. Nolan saw it differently, explaining that the line was being held in reserve for an upcoming production program, a form of built-in expansion that would let Blackwood grow without ever having to build a new facility from the ground up. Vivian's perception of him shifted again in that quiet, machine-lit corridor, though Nolan refused to let her feel too confident just yet. He reminded her that the deal still could not be called sound until they resolved the environmental liability tied to the land itself, land that had once stored industrial solvents decades earlier under a previous owner. If Blackwood inherited the full cost of remediation, the financial advantage they had just uncovered could vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. They found a passing reference to an old insurance rider meant to address exactly that liability, but the original document was nowhere inside the electronic data room the consultants had been given access to. Nolan remembered, with a flicker of dread, that a copy might still exist in an off-site storage facility, one that had flooded years earlier and had since been scheduled for final destruction the following morning. If they wanted the truth, they would have to find it before the shredding trucks arrived. And there was no guarantee the document had even survived the water damage in the first place. Vivian and Nolan arrived at the storage facility on the outskirts of town just as the first gray light of morning touched the rows of corrugated warehouses. The place smelled of damp cardboard and rust, a smell that seemed to seep into the back of the throat, and their footsteps echoed against concrete floors still faintly stained from the flood years earlier. Thousands of unlabeled boxes sat stacked to the ceiling, forgotten paperwork from decades of operations nobody had thought worth digitizing. Vivian wanted to call in a full team to help search, but Nolan warned that too many people moving through the building at once would draw attention long before they were ready to reveal what they had found. Her hands, more accustomed to the smooth glass of a tablet screen than the rough edges of water-warped cardboard, grew raw within the first hour, though she never once suggested stopping. Somewhere near dawn, she asked him quietly why he had chosen to stay in a job that so clearly underestimated him for so many years, and Nolan answered without looking up from the box in front of him, saying that after his wife passed, he had needed a schedule that let him be home for his daughter every night, even if it cost him a title he might otherwise have earned. Vivian said nothing for a long moment, only nodded, and kept searching beside him in silence that felt, for the first time since the meeting had begun, like something closer to partnership than obligation. He remembered that Asteron had once filed its older records by the year the land was purchased rather than the year any particular insurance policy was issued. A small quirk of an outdated system that most people would never think to check. After hours of searching through water-stained boxes in the gray morning light, he finally uncovered a certified copy of an agreement dating back nearly 2 decades. The document confirmed that the previous landowner bore the majority of responsibility for remediating contamination that existed before Asteron ever purchased the property. It also confirmed that a separate insurance policy had been issued to cover any additional liability beyond that original responsibility. Under the true terms of that agreement, Asteron's maximum exposure came to only a small fraction of the enormous figure the consultants had used to frighten the board away from the deal. Vivienne immediately called an independent environmental attorney who confirmed by phone that the coverage was still valid and enforceable under current law. One by one, the three pillars of the original warning report had collapsed under closer scrutiny. The warranty obligation had been counted twice by mistake. The canceled contracts had never actually been canceled at all. The environmental liability belonged mostly to someone else entirely, backed by insurance nobody had bothered to verify. Nolan still refused to celebrate, warning Vivienne that when so many experienced professionals make the same kind of error in the same direction, it is worth asking who chose the information they were allowed to see in the first place. The internal auditor soon discovered that Damien had personally instructed the consulting team to rely on a so-called standard data package prepared by his own office rather than pulling records independently. He had also quietly discouraged the consultants from interviewing operational staff without his prior approval, a restriction that conveniently kept anyone like Nolan far away from the investigation. Bryce Halstead, it turned out, had known the scope of the audit was being limited and had signed off on the final report anyway, choosing convenience over thoroughness. A separate email trail revealed that Damien had met privately with representatives from a rival investment fund called Crown Harbor Capital several separate times over the previous month, always at restaurants far enough from headquarters that no one from Blackwood was likely to notice him there. Crown Harbor, it appeared, was preparing its own offer to buy Asteron at a steep discount. The moment Blackwood walked away from the table, patient in the way predators are patient, content to wait for weakness rather than force it. The emails alone did not yet prove that Damien had been paid for his cooperation, but the pattern was impossible to ignore once laid out in a single timeline, each meeting falling suspiciously close behind a private board briefing he had personally attended. Vivienne now faced an uncomfortable choice, unsure whether to confront her chief financial officer immediately or continue quietly gathering evidence before making any move at all. Before she could decide, her phone rang, and Damien's voice on the other end informed her that the board meeting had been moved forward by 6 hours and would proceed to a vote on ending the acquisition entirely, with or without her presence in the room. The urgency in his tone told her everything she needed to know about how much he had to lose if she arrived prepared. Damien and Bryce moved first, launching a counterattack before the rescheduled meeting even began. They circulated a file to the entire board detailing a software transition project Nolan had overseen 6 years earlier, a project that had gone badly over budget and forced the factory to halt production for 3 difficult days. Bryce used that old failure to paint Nolan as a disgruntled technician trying to settle old scores against management rather than a credible source of information, and the framing spread through the room faster than the truth ever could. Financial news outlets picked up rumors that Blackwood was basing a major decision on the word of a low-level employee instead of its own celebrated consulting firm, and the company's stock dipped sharply before the markets even opened. Damien moved quickly to suspend Nolan's access to internal systems, citing data protection concerns that sounded reasonable on paper but felt, to Vivienne, suspiciously well-timed. She confronted Nolan directly and asked why he had never mentioned the failed project himself, and for a moment his usual composure wavered under the weight of an old wound reopened in public. Nolan explained that he had warned management at the time that the transition schedule was too aggressive, but his concerns had been dismissed by leadership eager to modernize quickly. When the system failed exactly as he predicted, he had taken responsibility for coordinating the recovery effort largely to protect the younger employees who might otherwise have taken the blame for a decision they never made. He had no paperwork to prove any of it, because the official meeting minutes from that period had since been quietly rewritten into a simplified summary that erased his early warnings entirely. Vivian did not know, in that moment, whether to trust him completely or to wonder if she had let herself believe in a story too convenient to be entirely true. She thought of every executive who had ever stood in her office promising loyalty right before betraying it, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt the old, practiced wariness creeping back into her chest, cold and familiar as an unwelcome guest. Nolan noticed the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders squared slightly as if bracing for another disappointment, and he did not try to soften it or plead his own case any further than he already had. Nolan told her plainly that she did not need to trust his character at all. She only needed to keep checking the evidence in front of her, wherever it led. There was something almost freeing in hearing him say it, a relief from the exhausting work of trying to read another person's intentions through their tone of voice alone. He suggested contacting the manager who had originally overseen that failed project, only to learn the man had long since retired and was not responding to any messages, leaving that particular thread frustratingly unresolved for the moment. Almost on cue, Crown Harbor Capital submitted a formal offer to purchase Asteron at a price far below what Blackwood had been considering, promising to close the deal within 3 days if accepted. The speed and precision of that offer suggested a buyer who had been preparing carefully long before any public announcement, someone who already understood exactly which hidden assets made Asteron worth pursuing. Elias Whitmore, meanwhile, was buckling under pressure from his bank and gave Vivian until noon the next day to make a final decision, warning that he would accept Crown Harbor's offer if Blackwood remained silent any longer. Security escorted Nolan out of the factory that afternoon under Damien's orders, but before he left the building, one small detail caught his attention and refused to let go. Buried inside Crown Harbor's offer documents was a reference to a specific technical certification code that had never appeared anywhere in the public record. Only a small handful of people inside Blackwood had ever been given access to information that specific, which meant Crown Harbor had not simply guessed that Blackwood would walk away. They had been handed, somehow, the exact list of assets worth chasing, delivered by someone who understood precisely what made this factory valuable long before Nolan ever explained it to the board. Locked out of the internal systems and barred from the building, Nolan shifted his search toward physical records instead, refusing to let a suspended login end the investigation entirely. He remembered that whenever confidential documents left the building through official channels, the mailroom kept a simple log listing file codes, even when the contents themselves remained undisclosed. He found June Calloway, the longtime mailroom supervisor, and asked her gently what she remembered about recent outgoing packages. June had worked in that basement mailroom for nearly 2 decades, long enough to remember Nolan as a younger, quieter engineer who used to bring her coffee on cold mornings, and she trusted him in a way she did not trust the men who normally sent her their sealed envelopes without so much as a glance in her direction. June recalled seeing Damien personally hand over a sealed envelope addressed to Crown Harbor's offices, though at the time she had assumed it was routine correspondence between 2 ordinary business partners. The log itself listed no descriptions, only file codes, but when Nolan compared those codes against Asteron's internal asset catalog, the match was immediate and unmistakable. The codes corresponded precisely to the material certification records, the reserved production capacity data, and the list of clients quietly transitioning into new framework agreements. Damien had sent Crown Harbor exactly the information Blackwood's own consultants had never been permitted to see, a quiet act of sabotage, disguised as routine paperwork. Nolan asked June to simply confirm the process as she remembered it without speculating any further about intent, since he wanted the facts to speak entirely for themselves once they reached the board. Vivian directed the legal department to secure every email, badge entry record, and outgoing document log connected to Damien's office before anything could conveniently disappear. The internal auditor soon uncovered a formal offer letter from Crown Harbor addressed to Damien, one that would only take effect once Asteron had been successfully acquired at a discounted price. Damien had not yet signed the letter outright, but his written replies negotiating equity terms and future compensation made his intentions painfully clear to anyone reading them in sequence. Nolan also managed to locate the retired manager from the old software project, who finally called back late that evening. The man confirmed, without hesitation, that Nolan had firmly opposed the rushed transition schedule years earlier and had ultimately saved the company from an even more damaging data loss during the crisis that followed. The old accusation meant to destroy his credibility crumbled the moment someone with first-hand memory was finally willing to speak up on his behalf. Vivian apologized quietly for having doubted him, even for a moment. But Nolan told her she had no reason to apologize at all. He said it was her responsibility to question everyone in this process, including him, because blind trust was exactly the mistake that had nearly cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars already. That single answer convinced Vivian, more than any document could have, that Nolan was not chasing power or personal advantage in any of this. Together, they prepared a new presentation for the board, and this time, Nolan refused to remain in the background as some anonymous source feeding lines to the chief executive. He insisted on standing before the board himself, since he was the one person in the entire company who truly understood how the numbers connected to what actually happened on the factory floor every single day. When they finally walked into the boardroom that morning, they discovered that Bryce had already spent the earlier hours convincing much of the board that Nolan was simply manipulating the chief executive to protect his own job. Helena Blackwood, the chairwoman and Vivian's own aunt, gave each side a final window of time to present their case before any vote would be taken. She had a reputation for calm, unhurried patience that made grown executives more nervous than any shouted accusation ever could, and she watched Nolan settle into place at the front of the room the way a person studies an unfamiliar instrument, curious whether it could actually play the note it claimed to hold. Bryce argued that even if a handful of figures required minor correction, the overall risk profile of the deal remained essentially unchanged, a claim delivered with practiced confidence to the 20 consultants seated behind him, like a wall. Facing that wall alone, without a single ally beside him, Nolan felt his pulse climbing in his throat, the same nervous flutter he remembered from years earlier when he had first tried and failed to warn management about a software rollout gone wrong. He thought, briefly, of Mara asleep at home, of the promise he had made to always tell her the truth, even when it was inconvenient, and something in that memory steadied his hands enough to begin. He began not by attacking their intelligence, but by acknowledging the genuine skill each of them possessed. Their failure, he explained calmly, had never come from a lack of competence, but from relying entirely on one curated set of information handed to them by someone with a hidden interest in the outcome. He then walked through 5 points in careful, unhurried order. The warranty obligation had been counted twice following the software transition. 4 contracts marked as canceled had actually continued under new framework agreements with the same clients. Idle production capacity represented reserved future output rather than decline. Environmental liability belonged largely to a previous landowner and a still active insurance policy nobody had verified. And the aging production line carried enormous hidden value in its certifications and its years of accumulated testing history. A representative from one of the supposedly lost clients joined by phone and confirmed that the contract remained fully active under its new corporate structure. An independent environmental attorney confirmed the liability limits Nolan had described, and a certification specialist confirmed that Blackwood stood to save years of development time by acquiring Asteron intact rather than piecing it together from salvage. Helena turned to Bryce and asked directly whether he had known his audit scope had been deliberately restricted by Damien's office. Bryce hesitated before admitting that he had known, though he insisted he believed the chief financial officer was acting in Blackwood's own best interest at the time. Vivian then presented the evidence connecting Damien to the leaked documents sent to Crown Harbor, along with the quiet negotiations over his future position at their firm. Damien attempted to describe the exchange as an ordinary conversation between business partners, but the mailroom log and the unsigned offer letter made that explanation impossible for anyone in the room to accept. The board voted to suspend him immediately pending a full independent investigation, and Bryce's firm lost the consulting contract on the spot, facing its own professional ethics review in the weeks that followed. The board agreed to continue pursuing the acquisition, but Elias Whitmore, sensing that Blackwood now understood exactly what his company was truly worth, suddenly demanded a higher price than originally discussed. Elias raised his asking price substantially and gave Blackwood only 2 hours to respond before he would consider other offers waiting in line behind them. Several board members wanted to walk away entirely, convinced that the seller was simply exploiting the momentum of the moment for personal gain. Vivian felt her frustration rising, though she understood that Elias was under his own relentless pressure from the bank holding his company's debt. Rather than arguing over uncertain future value, Nolan proposed turning that uncertainty into a condition that would have to be proven rather than simply promised, an idea that came to him not from any finance textbook but from years of watching factory contracts get renegotiated on the floor whenever a customer demanded proof before payment. He explained it patiently to a room full of people accustomed to complicated financial models, keeping his language as plain as he could manage, because he believed the strongest ideas were usually the simplest ones dressed up to look complicated. He designed a payment structure where Blackwood would pay the original base price up front, with Asteron receiving additional payments only as the disputed contracts actually converted into real revenue over time. Elias himself would receive a bonus if the reserved production line hit its performance targets within a set number of months, while a portion of the total price would be held back to cover any obligations nobody had discovered yet. Damien's replacement on the finance team ran the numbers twice, visibly startled that a structure this elegant had come from a man with no formal training in deal architecture, and admitted quietly to Vivian afterward that it solved a problem the entire finance department had been circling for hours without success. The structure allowed Elias to preserve his pride and still reach the number he wanted, without forcing Blackwood to pay up front for benefits that remained unproven. Nolan also insisted on adding protections for the workforce, guaranteeing job security for at least 2 years following the sale. When Vivian asked how that clause actually benefited Blackwood rather than simply the employees themselves, Nolan explained that the true value of the factory lived inside the experience of its people, and firing them would only mean destroying the very asset Blackwood had just spent so much effort trying to buy. Elias accepted the terms almost immediately, visibly relieved to have found a buyer who understood what his life's work actually meant. His eyes briefly wet in a way he tried to disguise by clearing his throat and looking down at the papers in front of him. Crown Harbor made one final attempt to raise their own offer, but they refused to guarantee the factory would remain intact, unwilling to match the workforce protections Nolan had built into Blackwood's proposal. Elias chose Blackwood in the end, not because of the number alone, but because Nolan's structure gave Asteron a genuine chance to keep operating as the company he had spent his life building. The final agreement was signed with only minutes to spare before the deadline expired. Afterward, Vivian offered Nolan the position of vice president, overseeing the integration of Asteron into Blackwood's broader operations. He did not answer right away, aware that a role like that might require constant travel, time he was unwilling to take away from raising his daughter alone. Vivian quietly restructured the position instead, allowing him to remain based mostly in his hometown and travel to headquarters only when it truly mattered. Nolan agreed to the new role, but only under one condition of his own. He asked that his team be given the authority to report directly to the chief executive whenever financial data failed to match what was actually happening on the factory floor, a permanent safeguard against exactly the kind of manipulation that had almost cost everyone everything. Vivian agreed without hesitation, recognizing that the condition protected the company far more than it protected him personally. 6 months later, Asteron was operating smoothly under Blackwood's ownership, its future looking far steadier than anyone in that first tense meeting could have imagined. The contracts once written off as lost had converted into steady, reliable revenue, exactly as Nolan had predicted they would. The reserve production line came online ahead of schedule, and its output helped Blackwood secure a major strategic manufacturing contract that had once seemed entirely out of reach. More than 3,000 jobs were preserved in the process, a number that mattered far more to Nolan than any title or bonus ever could. The investigation into Damien concluded that he had seriously violated his governance obligations and deliberately concealed a damaging conflict of interest for personal gain. Bryce's consulting firm was forced to return the majority of its fee and overhaul its independent verification procedures, a quiet but significant blow to its reputation across the industry. Nolan became vice president of operational integrity, though he chose to keep a modest office inside the very factory where his career had begun, its window still looking out over the same pressing line where he had once stood as an anonymous engineer nobody thought to consult. He established a new internal policy requiring that any major transaction include direct input from the employees who actually operated the systems being evaluated, a rule born entirely from his own experience of almost being silenced in a room full of people who assumed his silence meant he had nothing worth saying. Damien eventually resigned before the investigation concluded, and Bryce's name quietly disappeared from the letterhead of his own firm. Within the year, a fall neither man discussed publicly, but everyone in the industry understood. During the public announcement of the finalized results, Vivian refused to accept full credit for the outcome, choosing instead to invite Nolan onto the stage in front of the assembled board and press. The cameras caught him hesitating at the edge of the stage for just a moment, the same instinct to stay small rising in him one final time before he stepped forward anyway, because he had learned by then that some truths were worth the discomfort of being seen. 20 experts told us to walk away, she said, looking out at the room that had once dismissed him entirely. One person had the courage to show us exactly where they were wrong. Nolan kept his own remarks brief, saying simply that numbers only mean something when the person reading them understands what they represent in the real world beyond the page. After the event ended, his phone rang once more, Mara asking whether he would make it home in time for dinner after everything that had happened that day. He glanced toward Vivienne, who was already closing her folder of notes for the evening. She told him, with something close to a smile, that whatever remained on the agenda could easily wait until morning. Nolan left the building that night, not as a hero anyone had chosen to reward, but as the one person who had quietly forced an entire company to remember how to listen.